Hi everyone, I'm Freddie. I'm one of the registrars in the East Midlands on the North rotation. I'll talk to you about how to survive the exam, the FRCS Orth. So we'll split this into a few parts. First is know your enemy, so some details and logistics about the exam, how to apply for the exam, what does the exam entail, and all the admin and the paperwork involved. Then we'll talk about preparing, so when to start preparing, how to prepare, and my single piece of advice of preparing early or starting early. Then asking for help and some advice on how to organise your prep and organising practice with other people, and then some reassurance about the exam in terms of when you know your enemy and know what to expect and you prepare well, there's no reason for you to be stressed or too anxious about the exam. So let's start. So know your enemy. So what's the exam? In orthopedic lingo, I think the exam is a life-changing injury, just exactly like your open tibias and other significant injuries that could potentially change your life. Because it will mess with your head a little bit in terms of requiring a lot of time for prep, which takes you away from your family, from your hobbies. You have to still deal with a full-time job, including on calls and dealing with all your admin for your RCP and all these things, as well as revising for the exam. So it is a tough period of your life, and you have to prepare those around you. You have to let family know in advance that it will be a busy 6 months to a year of your life where you will not be as available as you would like to during evenings and weekends. But my advice is don't let the exam happen to you. So take control of the exam, plan for it early and prepare family early. And that way don't let the exam control your life, but you take control of the exam. Right, so when do we sit the exam? So you're allowed to sit the exam once you've ARCP'd for ST6. Now it depends when your ARCP is in terms of logistics and whether you need an early ARCP. So in our deanery, our ARCP is around about September. And now if you want to sit the exam in November, part 1, the deadline for applying is in August, so really you miss that deadline if you wait for your ARCP in September. But you can ask for an early ARCP if your deanery's ARCP date is in conflict with the deadlines. But that's what we did. We got an early ARCP in July, a few colleagues and myself, so just be wary of that. And I think it's probably best to try and sit it as early as possible. So if don't try and delay, because you will need time, and the earlier they get the exam out of the way, the better. But we'll talk about that in a minute. You have 4 attempts to sit the exam, and really with good preparation there's no reason to need all 4 attempts. And like I said, you're allowed to sit the exam after you finish ST6. So ideally you want to get the exam over and done with in ST7, so that your ST8 is dedicated for your subspecialty of interest or anything you need to finish before your CCT. Right, what's the exam made of? So the exam is made of 2 parts. So part 1 is all computer based. It's 2 papers. You actually do the exam in one of the test centres where other people will do their driving tests and professional tests and things. So it's not fully an orthopaedic environment or the environment you'd expect from an orthopaedic exam regulated by the Royal College and what have you, but it's just a computer-based exam. So the thing to bear in mind is you'll be around other people who may not be having as much of a serious exam as you are, so be prepared for that. It can take about all day, so you start in the morning and you're allowed to finish and start the papers with some flexibility in terms of how long you take as a break in between, and it's essentially just knowledge. And the way the exam part 1 is marked is slightly complicated, so I'm not going to try and explain it. Then part 2 is the real deal, is the beast. So it's 2 days over 3 days. So the exam period itself is 3 days, but everyone will be allocated to 2 days. So day 1 is where everyone sits their clinical exam. So everyone does that. And then day 2 and 3 is the vivas, but you split, so you either do day 2 or day 3. The clinical is split into intermediates and shorts. So intermediates, there's 1 upper limb intermediate and 1 lower limb intermediate, and that's 15 minutes each, where you take a history, do an examination, and then discuss your management. So 5 minutes each. You don't get bells in between those 5 minutes to let you know to move on, but some of the examiners are helpful and will tell you to move on to the next bit if they think you're running over a bit. And then the shorts, again, there's upper limb shorts, lower limb shorts, each is 15 minutes, so you get 3 cases per set of shorts, and you spend 5 minutes on each. And the focus with the shorts really is talking about your clinical examination and the reasoning behind it and how to use that to make a plan. So the focus here is not on the management, it's purely on the clinical assessment. With the intermediate it's slightly different because you're both assessment and management, so there is a part where you talk about the management. Now that's the clinical. So vivas, like I said, you're allocated 1 day. You're allocated to 1 day of the 2, and it's 4 stations, each is 30 minutes. So there is the adult pathology, which includes essentially anything. So it could be a spine, it could be a hip, a knee, it could be an ankle case, it could be anything, but it doesn't include any trauma. Then the second one is peds and hands, so that is 15 minutes each. That's the only station that is kind of split, and it's pretty self-explanatory, hands and peds. Your third is a trauma station, so 30 minutes in trauma, and the final one is basic science. So any topic in basic science can come up. Will include things like statistics, biomaterials, bone healing, any sort of basic science topic can come up. Okay, what it felt like on the day was like that scene from Gladiator, where they were all just waiting to get into the Colosseum and were instructed to say, "Those who are about to die salute you." That was exactly us in the holding bit before we went into the Viva stations. So it was a big hall, lots of tables, all the examiners waiting for us, and we were lined up by order to go in, and between each station we went out, lined up again, and went in, and 4 times we did the same. That's what it felt like. My advice for preparation is start early. So I'm not saying that you need to start revising fully from ST3, but what I'm saying is you need to bear it in mind from early on. So try and read up on every job you're doing, and make some simple notes that you can refer to when you come to fully revise for the exam. So don't just spend your time on each job you do from ST3. No, actually try and make sense of that job, understand the rationale for things, and always, that's not just for the exam, that's for your progression, always try and ask yourself, if I'm a consultant in that subspecialty, what would I do? And that will steer you towards a certain level of knowledge, a certain level of decision making, and that will help for preparing for the exam, because that's essentially what they're testing. They're testing you as a day 1 consultant. The other piece of advice, which is something I struggled with, is check your resources early. So there is a few resources for the exam which I'll talk about in a minute, but the commonest question or the commonest trade-off is do I use Miller's or do you use the American College or American Association book? And that's why you need to start a little bit early. Check these resources, try and read from Miller's, try and read from the AOS book, and see which one do you prefer, because you don't want to be wasting time checking resources and jumping between different books when you're actually preparing for the exam. And that's what I did. I jumped resources quite a lot. So maybe take a look at these early so you can have an idea, and maybe use these as you read up on each job. In terms of time to allow for the exam, I think you should start 6 months in advance, and you aim to knuckle down from 3 months before the exam. So that's what you need to plan for, that's what you need to tell your family about, that's what you need to build into your timetable. 6 months before part 1, 6 months before part 2, or if you're doing November, February for example, then you have less, but obviously 6 months before part 1 will allow you to include some prep for part 2 as well. How to prepare for part 1. My advice is to have one reference, like I said, either Miller's or AOS. There's other things, but these are the main ones really. Have one source of basic science knowledge. So yes, Miller's and AOS cover basic science, but there's other resources that are more specific and geared towards the exam for basic science, and obviously the most common one is Ramachandran. I found it difficult to read to start with, but I had to go to in the run-up to the exam. One source of anatomy and approaches, so the commonest used is Hoppenfeld, but there are other ones, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Key thing really for part 1 is lots of questions. Do lots of questions from books, from websites, because that's how you prepare for the exam. Questions will help you practice your knowledge and guide it, so you're not wasting time reading stuff that is not important. I did all of the author bullets questions, which included the free and the paid ones. Now they were useful for consolidating my knowledge, but they're certainly not the type of questions you get in the FRCS. They're different, they're the American exam, but they were useful. Now part 2, if you've made notes in part 1, or if you're certainly someone who prefers to make notes, then use these for part 2, or try and bear in mind part 2 when you're preparing your part 1 exam, when you're preparing part 1 notes, because then you can gear them towards part 2 as well. So some people like flashcards, some people like to use computer programs or apps. Again, that's one thing I struggled with and wasted time trying different things. I tried handwritten notes, I tried flashcards, I tried computer programs, and then finally ended up making a massive PowerPoint presentation with all the Viva questions that we did in our practice, and I had north of 600 slides on that PowerPoint. Now the key to part 2 is practice, practice, practice. So make a group with 1 or 2 more people. Don't go any more than that. More than 3 people in a group is probably too much, and you don't get as much out of it as you should. Make a group, start early, let your consultants know to start quizzing you, and what you need to do is speak to senior colleagues who've done the exam, senior registrars, and do some practice with them to start with, and then start to book practice with consultants. That's what we did, and a useful thing is to have a shared calendar and use that to book all your practice sessions so everyone is aware of availability and what sessions are coming up. And ask everyone, because you'll be surprised, everyone is very, very keen to help because they know what the exam is like and how difficult it can be. So you'll be surprised by the level of help you get from people. Resources, like I said, there is Miller's and the AOS. Miller's is good in the point of view it's comprehensive, but it's very bullet point, concise. It doesn't always explain things, so you might not really get a sort of understanding in some topics because it's just bullet point facts. But it's useful, it's just the one book. The AOS gives you more understanding, it's a more wordy book, so there's 2 or 3 versions or 2 or 3 books in the same edition. I used a slightly different book in conjunction with these, which is called Current Orthopedic Practice. I found it explained things, especially arthroplasty, which I really struggled with, certain concepts in the biomechanics and revision and things, and that I found that very useful. I didn't use it for everything, but I used it for certain topics and I found it useful. There's again Hoppenfeld we talked about for the anatomy, but there is the Miller's version of the approaches, and it's a nice book. It's got good images, so you might want to use that. There's, like we said, Ramachandran for basic science versus others. There is one book that we found useful in part 2, which is Concise Orthopedic Notes. You might find that there are some mistakes or some things missing, but generally it's a very comprehensive book. It includes references and articles to quote in your answers for part 2, and it's a good thing to have on hand so you can just flick through, pick a topic and start to practice. We found that useful. It was an advice given to us by more senior colleagues. Obviously the Banaskevich books. Now these are funny ones. I didn't use them for part 1. I used them for part 2, but even for part 2 I found the book slightly annoying. I'd like to say it was good because it included different scenarios and different cases for part 2, but the answers were, this is how the poor candidate would answer and this is how the good candidate would answer. It wasn't very clearly marked which is which, so you often read something and then realised, oh, actually that's the poor answer, so you wasted time reading the poor answer. So what I used it for is to actually pick what cases are being discussed or tested and then made my own prep for these. There's a couple of other big textbooks that were recommended on websites such as Apley's and the Oxford textbook. I borrowed these from the library and I didn't really feel they added much compared to Miller's or AOS, so I really returned them and didn't use them. Some people prefer websites or YouTube, so these are valid resources, but I think you need to use them in conjunction with the textbooks. So there's obviously Author Bullets. There is a good website called Hip and Knee, which talks about arthroplasty and simplifies concepts of arthroplasty with good images. Certainly YouTube is used by people for certain things, and certainly there's the Quentang series on basic science, so yes, there are good online resources that you could use. Courses, now I would say courses are expensive, so be selective. You don't have to go to all courses. I think having a course or two under your belt is good, but you don't have to go to several unless you feel you need it, and really have to justify and be sure that the course is useful before you pay well, nearly £1,000 for some of them. So the one I went to was the Banaskevich course, which I found really useful, and it was worth every penny. It was essentially 4 to 5 days of Viva practice and 1 full clinical practice with real patients. So it was really useful and it was worth the money. There is a couple of other similar courses. There is the Miller's Review, I think, in Oxford. There's multiple courses by Rishida, so you can look at these as well. Then there is some specific ones. There's a Chesterfield course for clinical examination. That was useful. Sadly I didn't get a spot on it, but some of the examiners were people that we practiced with in the run up to the exam. I was in Chesterfield when I was doing part 2. There is one course that I did, which is the PEDS Alder Hay course. It was 2 days and it was good. It covered the knowledge as well as some practice. Sadly I wasn't that close to the exam when I did it, so I wasn't ready for a formal Viva, so it was just a casual Viva for me, but other people did the formal Viva. There's some specific courses. There's some specific basic science courses, spine examination courses, but obviously make use of whatever your deanery is also providing. So if your deanery does a cadaveric day, which ours did, use that as your revision for your approaches. Our deanery also had a tumour day, so that was in the run up to the exam, quite close, so I didn't go, but I'd done all the prep with one of the main consultants that was talking on the day, and he's the authority to go to locally, so we've done that already. Didn't have to go less than a week before the exam, but that would be a useful thing if you're more junior. Again, like I said, courses are expensive, so be selective. So the exam is a team sport, so don't go through it on your own. So certainly for part 2 you need a practice group, like we said, and make sure it's the right size. Don't go for a big group. part one, you certainly need a buddy at least to kind of encourage you, and you can share things together and talk about how you're revising and how you're preparing. Use your education supervisor and clinical supervisor, ask them to viva you, let them know in advance that you're doing the exam so that they can allow you some slack in terms of, you know, if there is a small clinic, they can let you go home early or let you go to the library, or all these things. Your supervisor would be very understanding because they know what the exam's like. Other colleagues, other consultants, like we said, for practice, know who the people are in your deanery that are either examiners or have good knowledge and experience with the exam, and do practice with people. And certainly, you know, your patients day to day in clinic and on the wards, use these for your clinical exam. And final words, the exam is hard, but it's not impossible. Majority of people will end up passing it, so there's no reason to fear the exam. Just be prepared for it. Lean on your support network, and that will include your family, friends, colleagues, supervisors. Use these, lean on them, and it's just something that you have to do. It's hard, but it's not impossible. Certainly the exam is there to help you get through the final stages of your training, so it's not there to break you, it's there to make you. Just think of the things to come after that, and I realised after doing the exam that actually it's not over yet, and it's application for fellowships and thinking of CCT and all of these, but essentially you're taking off one big tick box in your training by doing the exam, and you can focus on, you know, your subspecialty of interest, your fellowships, all these things afterwards. So think about what's coming after. What I would say is take it easy. So don't let the exam happen to you. Take control, take it easy, you'll get through it.